When I developed probability theory through correspondence with Fermat, solving practical problems about games of chance, I never imagined this mathematical tool would unlock the most profound question of human existence. Consider this: every decision you make involves calculating risks under uncertainty. You invest in stocks without guarantee of return. You choose careers without certainty of success. You marry without proof your spouse won't change. Yet when it comes to the ultimate question, whether God exists, people suddenly demand absolute certainty before committing. This is mathematically absurd. Tonight, I'll demonstrate why rigorous risk analysis proves that faith isn't a leap into darkness, but the most rational choice an intelligent person can make. The same mathematical precision we apply to financial investments reveals that belief in God offers infinite expected value, while skepticism risks infinite loss. This isn't merely philosophical speculation, it's mathematical proof that smart people choose faith. Chapter 1: The Mathematics of Uncertainty in Life. Every morning you wake up and make dozens of decisions under uncertainty. You drive to work despite the statistical possibility of accidents. You eat breakfast trusting the food won't poison you. You interact with people assuming they won't betray you. Life itself is an endless series of probability calculations where we act without complete information, and this is perfectly rational behavior. In my work with Fermat, we discovered that optimal decision-making under uncertainty follows precise mathematical principles. When we cannot achieve certainty, we calculate expected values, the probability of an outcome multiplied by its consequence. A 10% chance of winning 1,000 has an expected value of 1,000 has an expected value of 1,000 has an expected value of 100, making it rational to pay up to $99 for this opportunity. Yet observe the curious inconsistency in human reasoning. The same people who comfortably invest in stock markets based on probability analysis suddenly demand absolute proof when considering spiritual questions. They'll risk their life savings on market predictions with 60% confidence, but refuse to consider faith without 100% certainty. This demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of how rational decisions work. In mathematics, we never demand certainty where it's impossible to obtain. Instead, we work with the best available evidence and calculate the optimal strategy given our limited information. The question isn't whether we can prove God's existence with mathematical certainty. That's not how probability works. The question is, given the evidence available and the stakes involved, what does risk analysis recommend? When we apply the same mathematical rigor to spiritual questions that we use for financial decisions, remarkable conclusions emerge. Consider how you already live by faith every day. You trust that your bank will honor your deposits, that your employer will pay your salary, that your doctor's diagnosis is accurate. These aren't certainties, they're probability assessments that guide rational action. Faith in God operates on identical mathematical principles, but with stakes infinitely higher than any earthly investment. Chapter 2: Quantifying the Infinite Stakes. Traditional decision theory becomes fascinating when we introduce infinite payoffs. In standard gambling, losses are finite, you might lose your money, but the damage is bounded. The God question introduces variables of unlimited magnitude that transform the entire mathematical landscape. If God exists and rewards faith with eternal happiness, the payoff is literally infinite. If God exists and punishes unbelief with eternal separation, the cost is infinitely negative. These aren't arbitrary religious claims, they're the logical implications of an infinite being's relationship with finite creatures. Let me demonstrate the mathematics clearly. Assign any probability greater than 0 to God's existence, even 0.0001%. When you multiply this tiny probability by infinite consequences, the expected value becomes infinite. This is mathematical fact, not religious opinion. Compare this to the costs of belief. What do you sacrifice by living faithfully? some pleasures, some pride, some time in prayer and worship. These costs are significant but finite. Even if you assign the maximum possible value to these sacrifices, they remain mathematically negligible when weighed against infinite stakes. This creates an asymmetric risk profile that any rational analyst would recognize. The potential upside is unlimited, the potential downside is bounded. The investment required is modest, the potential return is infinite. No financial advisor would hesitate to recommend this opportunity. Critics object that we can't quantify infinite values, but this misunderstands the mathematics. We don't need to calculate infinity precisely, we only need to recognize that any finite cost becomes negligible when the alternative involves infinite consequences. This is elementary mathematical reasoning. Furthermore, the analysis holds even with extreme skepticism about God's existence. As long as you assign any non-zero probability to God's reality, and intellectual honesty demands this, given the evidence from design, consciousness, moral experience, and historical testimony, the expected value calculation favors faith. This isn't manipulation or wishful thinking. It's the same mathematical principle that guides every rational decision under uncertainty. The God question simply involves stakes higher than any other choice you'll ever make. Chapter 3: Evidence-Based Probability Assessment. Rigorous risk analysis requires honest evaluation of available evidence to assign reasonable probabilities. We cannot simply assume God's existence is equally likely as his non-existence. We must examine the data like any scientific hypothesis. Consider the evidence from design in nature. The fine-tuning of universal constants that permit life defies random chance by astronomical margins. The probability that gravity, electromagnetic force, and nuclear forces would randomly align within the narrow parameters necessary for stars, planets, and life approaches zero. A rational analyst cannot dismiss this as mere coincidence. Consciousness presents equally compelling evidence. Materialist science cannot explain how subjective experience emerges from objective matter. The hard problem of consciousness remains unsolved because purely physical processes cannot account for the qualitative nature of thoughts, emotions, and sensations. This suggests reality includes non-material dimensions that point toward God's existence. Moral experience provides additional data. Humans universally recognize objective moral obligations that transcend cultural preferences. This moral knowledge implies a transcendent source of moral truth. Without God, moral claims reduce to subjective opinion, yet we experience moral obligations as genuinely binding, evidence for a moral lawgiver. Historical testimony adds further weight. Multiple independent sources document the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The rapid spread of Christianity among witnesses willing to die for their testimony suggests extraordinary events occurred. While miracles cannot be proven scientifically, they constitute legitimate historical evidence that affects probability calculations. Personal religious experience, reported across cultures and centuries, provides empirical data that purely materialist worldviews struggle to explain. These experiences may not constitute proof, but they shift probability estimates in favor of spiritual reality. When we honestly evaluate all available evidence, cosmological, biological, psychological, moral, historical, and experiential, the probability of God's existence significantly exceeds 50%. Conservative estimates based on cumulative evidence from multiple independent sources suggest probabilities well above the threshold needed to make faith mathematically rational. This evidence-based approach respects both scientific methodology and intellectual honesty. We're not claiming certainty, but demonstrating that reasonable probability assessment, combined with infinite stakes, makes faith the optimal rational choice. Chapter 4: The Psychology of Risk Aversion and Faith. Human psychology reveals fascinating patterns in how we handle risk that illuminate the faith decision. Most people exhibit risk aversion. They prefer certain smaller gains over uncertain larger ones, even when expected values favor the riskier option. Yet this natural tendency works against optimal decision-making in the God question. Traditional risk aversion makes evolutionary sense when dealing with finite resources. Our ancestors who hoarded food during abundance survived famines better than those who gambled everything on uncertain future abundance. This psychological programming serves us well in most earthly contexts. But the God question involves infinite stakes where normal risk psychology becomes counterproductive. When potential payoffs are unlimited, risk aversion prevents optimal choices. It's like refusing to buy fire insurance because you can't guarantee your house will burn, the small cost justified by catastrophic protection. Consider how this plays out practically. Many people acknowledge evidence for God's existence but resist commitment because they can't achieve absolute certainty. They want to hedge their bets, maintaining spiritual options while avoiding the costs of genuine faith. This feels psychologically comfortable but represents mathematically suboptimal strategy. Furthermore, modern culture has conditioned us to avoid any decision that might later prove embarrassing. We fear being judged as irrational for believing without complete proof. But this social pressure corrupts clear thinking about probability and evidence. The question isn't whether sophisticated people will mock your faith, it's whether your decision optimizes outcomes given available information. Successful investors understand that perfect information never exists. They make calculated decisions based on best available evidence, knowing that waiting for certainty guarantees missed opportunities. The same principle applies to spiritual investment. There's also the psychology of commitment itself. When we make wholehearted decisions based on reasonable evidence, we often discover additional confirmation that wasn't visible from our position of uncertainty. This isn't self-deception, it's how human knowledge frequently works. We understand by doing, not just by analyzing. The mathematical analysis cuts through psychological biases that prevent optimal choice. When infinite stakes are involved, even small probabilities of God's existence make faith mathematically compelling, regardless of our emotional comfort with uncertainty. Reason corrects intuition when dealing with unprecedented scenarios like infinite consequences. Chapter 5. Comparing faith to other life investments. To properly evaluate faith's rationality, we must compare it to other major life investments that people make routinely without demanding certainty. This comparison reveals that faith actually involves less risk and more evidence than many choices we consider obviously rational. Consider education. Students invest years and substantial money pursuing degrees without guarantee of employment or success. The education industry cannot prove that specific knowledge will remain relevant or valuable. Yet we consider educational investment obviously rational because the expected benefits justify the costs, even with significant uncertainty. Marriage represents an even more dramatic parallel. People commit their entire lives to another person based on limited information and statistical knowledge that roughly half of marriages fail. No one can prove their chosen partner won't change, betray them, or prove incompatible. Yet we consider marriage rational because potential benefits, love, companionship, shared purpose, justify the risks. Career choices involve similar uncertainty. People spend decades developing expertise in fields that might become obsolete through technological change. They cannot guarantee their chosen profession will provide satisfaction, security, or meaning. Yet these commitments seem rational because potential rewards justify the investment of time and effort. Financial planning assumes even more uncertainty. Retirement investing requires faith that economic systems will remain stable, currencies will retain value, and governments will honor obligations across decades. No one can prove these assumptions, Yet financial advisors universally recommend long-term investing because expected returns justify current sacrifices. Each of these investments involves sacrificing present certainty for future benefits that cannot be guaranteed. The God question operates on identical principles but with superior evidence and infinitely better potential returns. Faith requires believing in an intelligent creator based on design evidence, moral experience, historical testimony, and personal spiritual experience. This evidence base exceeds what supports most major life decisions. Meanwhile, the potential returns, eternal meaning, purpose, joy, and relationship with God infinitely exceed any earthly investment. Furthermore, faith's costs are actually modest compared to other major commitments. Unlike marriage, career, or education, faith doesn't require you to abandon reason, sacrifice intellectual honesty, or ignore evidence. Christian faith demands love of truth and careful thinking about ultimate questions. When we honestly compare faith to other investments we make routinely, it emerges as one of the most rational choices available, supported by substantial evidence and offering unlimited returns for reasonable costs. Chapter 6: The Practical Benefits of Belief Independent of Truth. Mathematical analysis becomes even more compelling when we examine faith's practical benefits independent of whether God actually exists. Even in a worst-case scenario where God doesn't exist, faith produces measurable improvements in human flourishing that justify the investment on purely secular grounds. Research consistently demonstrates that religious believers experience better mental health, stronger social connections, greater sense of purpose, improved physical health, and enhanced resilience during difficulties. These benefits aren't marginal, they're statistically significant and practically important improvements in human well-being. From a purely pragmatic standpoint, faith functions as one of the most effective technologies for human flourishing ever discovered. It provides meaning during suffering, community during isolation, hope during despair, and moral guidance during ethical confusion. These aren't religious claims, they're empirically documented effects of religious belief and practice. Consider the social benefits. Religious communities create networks of mutual support that enhance survival and prosperity. They provide institutional frameworks for charity, education, and social cooperation that benefit believers and broader society. Even skeptics acknowledge religion's positive role in building social capital and encouraging pro-social behavior. Faith also provides psychological frameworks for processing suffering and death that secular worldviews struggle to match. When facing mortality, loss, or meaninglessness, religious believers possess resources for maintaining hope and purpose that purely materialist perspectives cannot easily replicate. Furthermore, faith encourages moral behavior through accountability to transcendent standards rather than merely social expectations. This creates internal motivation for ethical conduct that benefits both believers and society. Even if moral obligations aren't ultimately objective, believing they are produces better behavior than believing they aren't. The intellectual benefits are equally important. Faith encourages wrestling with ultimate questions about purpose, meaning, and destiny that purely secular perspectives often avoid or dismiss. This philosophical engagement enriches human understanding and provides frameworks for addressing existential concerns. From a cost-benefit analysis, even if God doesn't exist, faith provides sufficient practical benefits to justify its costs. When we add the possibility that God does exist with infinite positive consequences, the mathematical case becomes overwhelming. This double-layer analysis, practical benefits plus infinite potential benefits, makes faith mathematically compelling even for people who assign relatively low probability to God's existence. You're investing in proven human flourishing with unlimited upside potential. Chapter 7: Addressing Common Mathematical Objections. Sophisticated critics raise several mathematical objections to this analysis that deserve careful examination. These objections often reveal misunderstanding of probability theory or attempts to avoid the logical force of the argument through technical escape routes. The first objection claims we cannot assign meaningful probabilities to God's existence because this isn't a repeatable experiment. This misunderstands probability theory. We routinely assign probabilities to unique historical events, future scenarios, and theoretical possibilities based on available evidence. Probability in real-world decision-making rarely involves classical frequency distributions. Another objection argues that infinite payoffs make the mathematics meaningless because any positive probability yields infinite expected value, reducing the analysis to meaninglessness. This confuses mathematical technicalities with practical decision-making. In real applications, we can use very large finite values to approximate infinite ones, and the conclusions remain unchanged. Critics also claim the argument proves too much because it would justify believing in any religion that promises infinite rewards. This objection misses the evidence-based probability assessment that distinguishes between different religious claims. We don't assign equal probabilities to all possible infinite stakes scenarios. We evaluate evidence to determine which possibilities are most credible. Some argue that forced belief based on calculation cannot be genuine faith that would merit divine reward. This objection misunderstands both the mathematics and the nature of faith. The calculation doesn't create belief directly. It removes intellectual barriers to experiencing and evaluating spiritual reality. Genuine faith involves much more than mathematical calculation, but mathematical analysis can clear the path for authentic spiritual experience. The objection that we cannot quantify spiritual realities misses the point. We don't need precise quantification, we only need to recognize that infinite consequences dwarf finite costs. This is basic mathematical reasoning that applies even with imprecise values. Perhaps the most sophisticated objection argues that many religious people live miserable lives, contradicting claims about faith's benefits. This confuses correlation with causation and ignores statistical evidence. Individual counterexamples don't negate overall statistical patterns showing improved well-being among religious populations. When examined carefully, these objections either rest on misunderstanding of probability theory or attempt to avoid the argument's force through technical objections that don't affect the core mathematical logic. The analysis remains sound. Reasonable probability estimates combined with infinite stakes make faith mathematically optimal, regardless of these attempted escape routes. The mathematics is compelling precisely because it doesn't depend on absolute certainty or precise quantification. It only requires honest assessment of evidence and basic understanding of decision theory under uncertainty. Conclusion. After decades of mathematical investigation, from probability theory to atmospheric pressure experiments, I've discovered that the same rigorous thinking that unlocks physical reality also illuminates spiritual truth. The God question isn't exempt from rational analysis. It demands our highest intellectual effort because the stakes are ultimate. The mathematics is clear. Any reasonable probability assigned to God's existence, when multiplied by infinite consequences, yields infinite expected value for faith. Meanwhile, the costs remain finite and modest. This isn't religious manipulation. It's mathematical analysis applied to life's most important decision. But the calculation only begins the journey. When you remove intellectual barriers through rigorous analysis, you discover that faith involves more than probability assessment. It opens experiential dimensions of reality that pure mathematics cannot capture but can point toward. The beautiful integration of reason and faith that emerges from this analysis reflects the fundamental harmony between truth and truth. Mathematical thinking leads naturally toward the source of mathematical order, the divine intelligence that makes rational universe possible in the first place. Your next step isn't merely intellectual assent to mathematical conclusion. It's practical experimentation with spiritual reality using the same empirical rigor you apply to scientific questions. Test and see whether faith delivers the benefits that analysis predicts. The evidence awaits your investigation.